Picture this: the Ottoman Empire at the height of its glory. Vast armies stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. The Sultan's word was law. His banners flew over 3 continents, and his power seemed limitless. But here's the twist. Some of the fiercest battles for control were not fought with swords on distant battlefields. They were fought in silence, behind the heavy gates of the Topkapi Palace. And at the very heart of it all, not the battlefield, not the treasury, but the Sultan's harem. Now, when you hear the word harem, you might imagine a place of beauty, luxury, maybe even indulgence. But in reality, the Topkapi harem was nothing less than a political battlefield. It was a world of secrets, whispers, alliances, and betrayals. Every look, every word, every favor could mean the difference between life and death. Here, love was dangerous, loyalty was uncertain, and power was everything. Inside these gilded walls, the struggle was not just about passion, it was about survival. Mothers fought to secure the throne for their sons. Lovers fought to hold the Sultan's heart. And sons, often young princes barely out of childhood, were caught in a game where losing could mean exile or execution. This wasn't a family drama you could simply walk away from. This was a game of bloodlines, a clash of ambition, a dance where every step had consequences for the empire itself. Think about it. What happens when the people closest to you, the mother who raised you, the lover you trust, the child who bears your name, suddenly become your rivals? What happens when family ties collide with power? That's the story we're about to uncover. A story of hidden battles fought in the shadow of the sultans, of women who rose from obscurity to become the most powerful figures in the empire, of sons who grew up under constant threat, knowing their own brothers could be their executioners. The Topkapi Palace wasn't just the seat of government. It was a stage, a theater where life, love, and death played out like the most dramatic of tragedies. And just like a Shakespearean play, there were heroes, villains, betrayals, and heartbreaks. But this wasn't fiction. This was history. So, as we step through the doors of Topkapi, I want you to imagine yourself there. Picture the polished marble floors, the scent of incense drifting through the air, the echo of footsteps in long corridors. Behind every curtain, a secret waits. Behind every smile, a strategy hides. This is not just the story of an empire, it's the story of ambition, survival, and the human hunger for power, played out within one of the most secretive palaces the world has ever known. And here's the truth. The struggle between mother, son, and lover was never just about the palace. It shaped the fate of millions. Wars were influenced, alliances were made or broken, and the very destiny of the Ottoman Empire turned on decisions whispered in those hidden chambers. So, let's begin this journey together. Step inside the world of the Topkapi harem, where love could elevate a woman from a slave to a queen, where a prince could rise or fall in a single night, and where family ties could be the deadliest weapon of all. Because here, in the shadows of Topkapi, the most dangerous Game of Thrones wasn't played with armies, it was played with hearts. When we think of a palace, we usually imagine gold, luxury, and endless beauty. And yes, the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul had all of that. Its halls were covered in tiles that shimmered like jewels, its gardens overflowing with roses and fountains that seemed to sing in the silence of the night. But hidden deep inside the palace was a world far more secretive, a world closed to outsiders, where even the most powerful men of the empire could not simply walk in. This was the Sultan's harem. Now, let's pause here. In the modern mind, the word harem often sparks images of romance or indulgence. But that image couldn't be more misleading. The Topkapi harem was not a place of idle pleasure. It was a carefully structured universe, a world of rules, hierarchies, and strategies, where every woman had a role to play. At its peak, this hidden world held 400 to 500 women, wives, concubines, and servants. Think about that for a moment. Imagine living in a space where hundreds of women, all connected to the most powerful man on earth, had to coexist under one roof. Every alliance mattered, every gesture was watched, and every rivalry could decide, not just a personal fate, but the fate of the empire. At the very top of this intricate hierarchy stood one woman, the Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother. She wasn't just the Sultan's mother, she was the empire's matriarch. In many ways, her word could weigh as heavily as the Sultan's own decrees. She decided who could see her son, which women would be favored, and sometimes even which princes were protected or sacrificed. History shows us that some sultans were deeply influenced, even outright controlled, by their mothers. The Valide Sultan managed the harem's immense wealth, directed its politics, and held the key to its survival. If you wanted power in Topkapi, you needed her approval, and beneath her, layers upon layers of hierarchy. Senior concubines, favored consorts, and the lesser-ranked women who dreamed of one day catching the Sultan's eye. Even the servants, often recruited as young girls from faraway lands, had their roles in this vast living machine. But here's where it gets fascinating. The harem wasn't simply a private residence. It was more like a living political chessboard. Every move mattered. Every smile, every whispered word could shift the balance of power. Think of it this way. A queen mother moves like the king on a chessboard, protective, powerful, central. A favored concubine might be the queen, with freedom to influence and strike where others could not. The young princes, they were pawns and knights, pieces that could either be sacrificed or rise to power. And the eunuchs, those silent guardians of the harem, were the rooks and bishops, controlling access and shaping the game from the shadows. It was a system where survival required wit, patience, and courage. Some women spent their entire lives climbing the ranks, while others fell from grace overnight. Exile to the old palace meant a life of obscurity and sometimes even death. Yet for those who could master this game, the rewards were unimaginable. Wealth, influence, and the chance to shape the destiny of an empire. And maybe that's the most surprising part. The decisions made inside these hidden chambers, the alliances between a queen mother and a concubine, the whispers shared with a eunuch, the quiet ambition of a young woman hoping to bear the Sultan's heir, could ripple outward to change the course of history. Wars, treaties, and the succession of rulers were all touched, in one way or another, by the silent battles fought inside the harem. So, the Topkapi harem wasn't just a place where women lived. It was the empire's heartbeat, pulsing with ambition and strategy. A world where luxury and danger existed side by side. A place where survival depended not on beauty alone, but on intelligence, loyalty, and the ability to play the game better than anyone else. The harem of Topkapi was more than just walls and chambers. It was a world unto itself, a world that could crown a woman as the empire's most powerful figure or erase her from memory forever. And as we move deeper into this story, one question remains. In a palace filled with hundreds of women, who would rise, who would fall, and who would outplay them all? Inside the Topkapi Palace, power was never absolute. Even the Sultan, with all his armies and riches, was often pulled between two powerful forces, his mother and his lover. And in the harem, this was no small tug of war. It was a battle of survival, of bloodlines, of destiny. On one side stood the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was the guardian of tradition, the protector of dynastic power. She had already survived the brutal game of succession to see her son rise to the throne, and she wasn't about to let anyone threaten that position. To her, the harem was not about romance. It was about control. She managed the flow of wealth. She chose which women gained favor, and she made sure her son's authority was never undermined. In many cases, the Sultan's mother was more than just an advisor. She was the empire's second ruler, whispering into his ear from behind the throne. But opposite her was another force, just as determined, just as ambitious. The Sultan's favorite consort, his beloved. She wasn't born into power. She earned her position through charm, intelligence, and sometimes sheer willpower. And her greatest weapon? The possibility of giving birth to a son who could one day inherit the throne. Now think about this for a moment. The Queen Mother wanted to maintain her influence, protect her son, and secure stability. But the consort? She wanted her own child, to be the next sultan. Can you see the collision course here? This wasn't just a family squabble. It was a struggle that could shape the future of the empire itself. The lover's influence came through intimacy. She had the sultan's ear. At night, in moments when his guard was down, she could soothe his doubts, spark his desires, and plant seeds of ideas that no statesman or advisor could. And yet, her position was always fragile. Without the protection of the Valide Sultan, or without producing a son, she could be cast aside in an instant, exiled, forgotten, erased from memory. So what did she do? She fought. Not always with daggers or poison, though sometimes those too, but with strategy. She built alliances with eunuchs who controlled access to the Sultan. She secured friendships with powerful officials. She created networks of influence, inside and outside the palace walls. And history gives us a shining example of this dangerous dance. Harem Sultan, also known as Roxolana. Harem began as a concubine in Suleiman, the Magnificent's harem. She was not born noble. She was brought to the palace as a captive. But her wit, her intelligence, and her ability to captivate Suleiman changed everything. Against centuries of tradition, Suleiman did the unthinkable. He made her his legal wife. No sultan before him had dared to break this rule, because marriage was seen as a weakness, a tie that could give one woman too much power. But Harem broke the mold. She became not only the sultan's wife, but also his most trusted advisor. She wrote letters to kings and queens of Europe. She sponsored mosques, schools, and charities. She even influenced matters of war and peace. And in doing so, she directly challenged the authority of the Valide Sultan, reshaping the balance of power in the empire forever. This battle between mother and lover was not always visible to the outside world, but its effects were enormous. Imagine the tension in those palace chambers. The mother, who had sacrificed everything to see her son crowned, watching another woman capture his heart and threaten her control. The lover, knowing every smile and every word could tip the scales in her favor, or seal her downfall. It was like a chess match where every move had consequences. A subtle word to the Sultan, a new alliance with a court official, a whispered rumor about a rival, and all of it played out under a cloak of silence. But here's the deeper truth. These women weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their children, for their bloodlines, for the future of their families. The stakes weren't measured in jewels or titles. They were measured in thrones. So when we talk about the Topkapi Harem, we're not talking about luxury and leisure. We're talking about a battlefield where emotions were weapons, where ambition burned brighter than love, and where the struggle between a sultan's mother and his consort could shape the destiny of millions. And maybe the most haunting question of all is this: who truly held the power, the sultan on his throne, or the women who battled for influence behind the veil? Tu noidung tren hoi giup toi tau 15th prompt, je tau ra an voitile 16th noin. Sapksep kach prompt nai teo tutu dientian video. Opening, discovery, treasures, curse, public reaction. Je kighep an vau video chicken theo flow kichban. Kong kanchin swan hiu. Inside the harem, the stakes were never higher than when it came to the Sultan's sons. These boys, born into privilege, were not just princes, they were rivals. Each one carried the blood of empire. Each one held the potential to rule. And, in the Ottoman world, that meant each one was also a threat. Unlike in Europe, where kingdoms often crowned the eldest son by default, the Ottomans had no fixed rule of succession. It wasn't always the firstborn. Instead, the throne went to whichever son could secure it. That meant brothers didn't grow up as playmates. They grew up as competitors in a deadly race. Imagine being a young prince in Topkapi. You're surrounded by tutors, guards, and servants. You're given the finest education in the empire: calligraphy, poetry, military strategy, Islamic law. You're raised to be a ruler. But you're also raised to know this chilling truth. If you lose the race for the throne, your brother's first command as sultan may be your execution, and this wasn't a distant fear. It was a law. The Ottoman practice of fratricide, the killing of brothers, was legalized under Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. The reasoning was brutal, yet clear. Better one death than civil war. A single heir meant stability. Multiple claimants meant chaos. And so, when a new sultan rose to power, the palace often echoed with silence and dread. Behind the celebrations of a coronation, behind the cheers of victory, came the sound of footsteps in the night. As the new ruler's brothers were quietly strangled with silk cords, their bodies buried in secrecy. The most chilling example comes from the reign of Murad III. When he became sultan in 1574, he ordered the execution of 19 of his brothers in a single night. 19 princes, sons of the empire, gone before dawn. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the fear, the grief, the cruelty of such a night. But to the empire, this was the price of stability. To the new sultan, it was survival. And what about the mothers? For them, this was agony. Every concubine who bore a son knew that her child carried both glory and doom. Raising a prince meant pouring your heart into a boy who might never live to be a man. Some mothers schemed endlessly to secure their son's future, knowing that if he did not wear the crown, he might not live at all. This transformed the harem into a battlefield of maternal ambition. Mothers forged alliances, whispered into the sultan's ear, and did everything in their power to protect their sons. But in a system where only one heir could survive, there was no safety. Even a mother's love could not shield a child from the law of fratricide. The tragedy of the princes is that they were often victims of politics long before they were rulers. Some were exiled to distant provinces, stripped of real power, living in gilded cages. Others were executed before they even had the chance to prove themselves. And yet the system endured for centuries, because the empire valued unity above brotherhood. But here's the haunting question. What did this do to the empire's soul? What does it mean when survival demands such cruelty? Did this law prevent chaos? Or did it slowly erode the very humanity of its rulers? There is no easy answer. For some, fratricide was a necessary evil, a brutal safeguard against endless civil war. For others, it was proof that absolute power demands absolute sacrifice. What we do know is this. Every Ottoman prince lived with a shadow hanging over him, a shadow cast not by enemies outside the palace, but by the brothers he grew up with inside it. In the Topkapi Harem, sons were not just the future. They were pawns in a deadly game. And as mothers and lovers plotted to secure the throne, these boys became the ultimate prize. Their survival, or their death, decided the fate of the empire. And so the harem's whispers were never just about love or jealousy. They were about life and death, about who would rise, who would fall, and who would be sacrificed on the altar of power. Because in the Ottoman Empire, to be born a prince was not always a blessing. Sometimes, it was a curse. By now, you can see that the harem was no simple household. It wasn't about silken cushions, golden lamps, or idle luxury. It was about survival. And survival in Topkapi meant mastering the art of intrigue. Every woman, from the lowliest servant to the Sultan's most beloved, lived under constant watch. A smile could be a weapon. A rumor could be a death sentence. And a single misstep could mean exile, or worse. Power in the harem wasn't taken with brute force. It was earned through cunning. Women formed alliances with eunuchs, the silent, guardians who controlled access to the Sultan. They slipped gifts into the hands of officials, hoping to win favors. They whispered in the right ears, planting seeds of doubt against rivals. Some even resorted to darker methods. Poison slipped into food, secret letters smuggled through hidden corridors, or forged accusations designed to destroy a competitor. In a world where hundreds of women lived in confinement, ambition became both a weapon and a shield. And let's not forget, the Sultan himself was often swayed by these currents. His moods, his desires, his insecurities, all of them were targets. The women who understood him best could bend his decisions. The ones who failed could vanish overnight, erased from history as if they had never existed. One of the most dangerous outcomes for a woman in the harem was banishment to the old palace. This was where failed consorts and their children were, sent, cut off from influence, doomed to obscurity. For many, it was worse than death, a living tomb where dreams of power turned into endless years of silence. But the harem also produced survivors, women who thrived in this world of whispers. Some became philanthropists, using their wealth to build mosques, schools, and hospitals. Others turned their personal survival into dynastic power, ensuring their sons reached the throne. Take, for instance, the story of Valide Sultan. Brought to Topkapi as a concubine, she rose to become not only the Valide Sultan, but effectively the ruler of the empire during the reigns of her sons and grandsons. She maneuvered through poison plots, assassinations, and coups, sometimes even orchestrating them herself. Her reign of influence lasted decades, longer than many sultans. But her end came just as brutally as the system she mastered, strangled by rivals in her own chambers. This was the truth of Topkapi. Every alliance was temporary. Today's friend could be tomorrow's executioner. Today's queen could be tomorrow's ghost. It raises a haunting question. How do you survive in a world where trust doesn't exist? Where even your closest companion might betray you if it meant climbing one step higher? Perhaps the answer lies in adaptability. The women who thrived in Topkapi weren't just beautiful. They were intelligent, strategic, and relentless. They understood that in a palace of secrets, knowledge was more valuable than jewels, and silence at times was the sharpest blade. But this world of intrigue came with a cost. Behind the glittering tiles and golden doors, the harem was filled with fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of failure, fear of being forgotten. And yet, it was also filled with resilience. Women who had no power in the outside world found ways to shape history from within these walls. They proved that influence doesn't always come from armies or crowns. It can come from whispers, from patience, from the ability to outlast your rivals. So when we talk about the Topkapi harem, we must strip away the myths of luxury and see it for what it truly was. A battlefield without swords. A world where every decision, every word, every glance could tip the balance of power. And perhaps the most fascinating part is this. Despite the betrayals, the poison, the endless rivalries, some women not only survived, they thrived. They bent the course of an empire to their will, proving that even in the most perilous game, survival was possible, for those clever enough to play it. It's tempting to think of the Topkapi harem as a world sealed away, a place where intrigue and rivalry never touched the outside world. But that's the illusion. The truth is far more extraordinary. The whispers inside those palace walls often shaped the fate of millions. A decision made in the harem could ripple outward, changing the course of wars, shifting alliances with foreign powers, or even determining who sat on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth. Let's take Harem, Sultan, the woman who rose from concubine to legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. Her influence didn't stop at the palace gates. Harem wrote letters to the King of Poland, engaged in diplomacy with European monarchs, and became a central figure in Ottoman foreign policy. Think about that. A woman who entered the empire as a captive, later shaping its relationships with nations far beyond its borders. Or consider Kosum Sultan, whose long reign of influence during the 17th century saw her effectively rule as regent for her sons and grandsons. She wasn't just managing the harem, she was steering the empire itself through periods of instability, rebellion, and war. Decisions she made directly influenced the survival of the dynasty. But there's a darker side to this influence. The internal rivalries of the harem often bled into the empire's politics. When mothers fought for their sons' futures, entire provinces could be thrown into chaos. When lovers sought to secure their children's claims, alliances with generals, or ministers often pulled the empire into dangerous divisions. Some historians argue that the constant interference of the harem weakened the Ottoman state over time, that the endless plots and assassinations eroded stability, creating fractures in leadership that the empire could not always repair. And yet, others see it differently. They argue that these women kept the empire afloat during moments when weak sultans sat on the throne. Without their guidance, without their ability to maneuver, the empire might have fallen into chaos much sooner. So which is true? Did the harem's power strengthen or weaken the Ottoman world? Maybe the answer lies somewhere in between. The harem magnified the empire's greatest strengths, its ability to adapt, to innovate, to draw talent and ambition from unexpected places. But it also magnified its greatest weaknesses, its reliance on fragile human relationships, its vulnerability to jealousy and betrayal. What we cannot deny is this: the harem was never just about personal drama. It was about empire. The struggles of mothers, sons, and lovers didn't stay confined to marble chambers. They spilled into battlefields, into palaces across Europe, into treaties and wars that shaped the map of the world. And maybe that's what makes the story of the Topkapi Harem so unforgettable. It reminds us that history isn't only written by kings on horseback or generals with armies. Sometimes it's written in whispers. Sometimes it's shaped by women behind veils, navigating a world that tried to silence them, yet could not stop them from bending the course of history. So the next time you picture the Ottoman Empire, its armies, its mosques, its endless lands, remember that much of its destiny was decided not in open councils, not on distant battlefields, but in hidden rooms filled with tension, ambition, and survival. Because in the end, the harem was more than a private world. It was the empire's beating heart, and every rivalry, every betrayal, every act of love or ambition that took place within it echoed across continents. This was the legacy of the Topkapi Harem, a place where survival meant strategy, where whispers carried the weight of armies, and where the destiny of one of the world's greatest empires was forever shaped by those who lived within its walls.